Well, now on BBC Radio 4, it's time for The Moral Maze. Live as usual is Michael Burke.
There are hundreds of boycotts of companies, goods and even people over everything from Israeli settlements in the West Bank to using kangaroo skin for football boots. The government says it's concerned about public bodies, local authorities for instance, joining these boycotts. It's gesture politics, the government says, that can even undermine national security. Locally imposed boycotts are to be made illegal, enforced by severe penalties. A government minister is expected to announce the details while on a trip to Israel, the target of many boycotts over the Palestinian issue, boycotts some see as a modern form of antisemitism. Critics are incensed at what they see as an anti-democratic crackdown that they say makes ethics illegal. So, should councils and other public bodies take ethical stands, some would say play political games, with our money? Wider question, are boycotts a good and moral way to express disapproval or a self-indulgent substitute for argument? That's our Moral Maze tonight. Our first witness is Jonathan Sacerdoti, who's Director of Communications for the Campaign Against Antisemitism. Mr. Sacerdoti, what's wrong with people showing their disapproval of Israeli policies by boycotting Israeli goods or companies that deal with Israel or involved in things that they don't like?
Well, everyone is, of course, welcome to make any choice in regards to what they purchase or attend based on anything they like. But there's quite a difference between that kind of boycott and what we see when organised fringe groups push their politics and bully and intimidate Jewish people. And in our study, we found that 84% of British Jews find the boycotting of Israeli shops and academics intimidatory, and 77% have witnessed anti-Semitism disguised as criticism of Israel. That's no longer a boycott, that's an intimidation and a bullying tactic, and it mustn't be allowed, and the government's right to stop them doing that through our local councils and publicly funded bodies.
Jill Kirby?
You're clearly concerned about the specific boycott and feel very strongly about it, but could we just first establish whether you feel that there are any boycotts that you would be prepared to support? Is there any value in a boycott?
Well, as I said, in the true meaning of the word boycott, absolutely. It's impossible to make people buy things they don't want to. If you aren't interested in a particular product because of a political opinion you have, well, that's your choice. But I don't think it remains a boycott when you have decided that you're going to intimidate other people into doing what you think because of your political opinions.
But you're talking about intimidation, not boycotts. Boycotts, to have any effect, have got to be some form of collective action. They have to move from the personal to the collective, really, to have any impact. I mean, that's what the original boycott did, and that's what most boycotts are about. For example, if there'd been a boycott in place of Nazi Germany, would you have joined that boycott? Would you have been happy to join in that campaign and boycott that regime?
Well, as I said, I think personally boycotting regimes or ideas that you don't like is absolutely fine. And of course, bringing along some of your friends if you feel that's going to do the job. But in this particular case, for example, that the government is specifically mentioning the fueling of anti-Semitism. So they themselves in this particular so-called ban are referencing Israel.
So it's this specific action against Israel
because I think it's also
about.
No, I also think it's the effect. And so if we look at the effect of that boycott as a good example, the effect in the Middle East is virtually nil. In fact, it's the opposite, and 1 in every 6 or 7 drugs on the NHS is Israeli made because it saves the NHS a vast amount of money because Israel has made these generic drugs available to the world. Things like that are very important.
So what you're saying is the boycott isn't really effective.
But the effect of that boycott on the UK is vast, and the effect is on the Jewish population of the UK. I represent the Campaign Against Antisemitism, and I can tell you that this is a concern for enormous numbers of Jewish people who feel intimidated and bullied by this particular so-called boycott campaign.
So do you think the government should be tackling the bullying rather than banning boycotts?
Well, that's what it is doing. It's not stopping anybody from making individual choices about products that they want or don't want to buy, but it is stopping them from hijacking universities, hijacking publicly funded bodies. The NHS should not have a foreign policy. That's the job of our national government, and that's what they're saying. If there are sanctions imposed by the government, then they're saying that it's absolutely fine for those to be taken into account in purchasing considerations of those nationally funded bodies. But it's not fine for every single local authority in the country to have a foreign policy that's decided by a fringe pressure group who has effectively bullied that group into doing what they want politically. That's not really a boycott. That's intimidation. And that's all the government is actually trying to deal with here.
Well, I'm not clear that it is. I think it's actually trying to stop political decisions about purchasing power being made by local authorities, which is a wider question.
When they fuel anti-Semitism and make a minority group within the nation feel intimidated and unwelcome in the country. Don't forget that last year saw the highest number of Jewish people leaving Europe for Israel since the aftermath of the Holocaust, and saw Jewish people killed across Europe. But we can't forget that these things are also playing on Jewish people's minds, and it's irresponsible to allow small politicized groups to try to have their way within the bodies of local government and education simply because they want to push that through in a way they couldn't on a national stage because it's not nationally popular with the electorate.
Matthew Taylor?
I'm somewhat confused now. So when I was at university a long time ago in the Students' Union, publicly funded, we would have a debate every year about Israel and Palestine, and depending on who won it, we would send a telegram of condemnation to Menachem Begin or to Yasser Arafat. So do you think that was totally inappropriate?
Not at all, and I'm sure Menachem Begin and Yasser Arafat were delighted to hear what your university thought of their particular policies. But what I'm trying to say is, if that intimidated the students of your university, if there was coordinated with that smashing of windows, setting off of fire alarms, as we've just heard from the Oxford University Labour Association, bullying of Jews.
You've made this point, but I think I'm trying to do what Joel was trying to do, which is you're conflating two things here. You're conflating...
I'm not conflating them. That boycott movement is conflating them.
You're conflating boycotts with the effect of boycotts on a particular group of people. So let's go back to that Students' Union resolution. So let's say the Student Union condemned Israel. If, as a result, the Jewish Society of the university was to come along and say, we felt really bad about that, that made us feel very hurt, would you then say, well, you shouldn't do it? You shouldn't have that debate if it upsets people?
Of course I wouldn't. But
you're saying the reason
you're putting words in my mouth.
Now let him answer.
That's absolutely not what I'm saying. I work in the field of public debate. That's why I'm here on this programme tonight.
Right.
What I would say to you is that if your technique for winning that argument in a university debate was intimidation of Jewish people, which increasingly is what we're seeing, whether it's the Oxford University Labour Society in the press today.
You're doing it again. But you're doing it.
Well, I'm doing it again.
There are laws.
That's what I'm here to tell you.
You're doing it again because there are laws against intimidation. There are laws against violence. If a grown-up group of people... hold on. If a grown-up group of people and a local authority choose to pass a resolution condemning a country because they think its actions are opposed to its political values, and that's all they do. They're grown. They're not being bullied into it, intimidated, not smashing windows. They're just saying, no, we don't agree with that country. What's wrong with that?
I didn't say there was anything wrong with that.
Well, that's what the government will. That's what the government will stop. Because if
the government explained their reasoning today when the announcement was made, and they said that actually this is about breaking law. They said that when it breaks international law, specifically the World Trade Organization Government Procurement Agreement Treaty, when there is this case of trying to discriminate against a specific country which is included in that and have some prejudice against that country, that is illegal in international law. That is why the particular boycott I'm referring to, and I presume why you invited me here to talk to you, was about that particular boycott. That is why that boycott is in fact illegal. But I'm also here to tell you, as a representative of a charity that deals with anti-Semitism, that 84% of British Jews in our latest polling found it intimidating.
But I understand that.
So even if that wasn't your intention, you've got to appreciate that if 84% of a minority group finds your apparently legitimate thing threatening...
Okay, so can we just establish this principle? If I was to demonstrate to you that 90% of British Muslims, it is of course a ridiculous thing, but 90% of British Muslims found it offensive to condemn ISIS, would you say you mustn't condemn ISIS because it upsets Muslims?
I would look at the way in which we're condemning ISIS.
Would you say that the fact that Muslims are hurt is a reason not to express your political view?
In the way that you're doing that hurts ordinary Muslims who have no affiliation to ISIS. But that's exactly the principle that's at play here. If what you're doing is done from a place of genuine concern and you feel it is absolutely right, but you are offending 84% of British Jewish people, you need to question the way in which you're doing it and find a less offensive way of doing it. 84% is an enormous proportion of a minority group, and if it doesn't bother you that, as I said, a time when Jews are being killed across Europe and driven out of Europe towards Israel and other countries out of fear for their lives, then you need to assess how you're pursuing those legitimate aims of yours for debate.
Jonathan Sacerdoti, thank you very much indeed.